Okay, so let's dive into this pretty tense situation. Things have been kind of quiet for a bit, right?
Mhm.
Like back in January 2025, there was this ceasefire that started between Israel and Hamas.
Yeah.
This was after a really, really long conflict that had been going on since like October 2023.
Yeah, long time.
So this ceasefire is a pretty big deal because they actually like exchanged their people, you know? Like Hamas released dozens of hostages.
Yeah.
And in return, Israel let go of almost 2,000 Palestinian prisoners.
Yeah.
It felt like a good step, like maybe things were going to calm down for real.
It did seem like a turning point, like a real chance for things to de-escalate. Families were reunited and the whole atmosphere shifted away from that constant tension. It opened up a space for dialogue, at least it seemed that way.
Totally. But then things took a hard left turn just a couple months later on March 17th, 2025.
Right.
That's when Israeli leaders announced they were going back to airstrikes on Gaza.
And what was their reasoning for breaking the ceasefire?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Katz both said it was because Hamas wouldn't agree to the terms for releasing more hostages.
Interesting. So there were these proposed frameworks from international mediators like U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff trying to get everyone on the same page. But ultimately, Hamas rejected them. I guess that really pushed Israel to resume military action. Seems like the sticking points around the hostages were just too big to get past.
Yeah, it does. And of course, the immediate outcome of this breakdown was a return to heavy military activity in Gaza. Whatever hope that ceasefire had built up kind of vanished overnight. It really makes you think about how fragile these agreements can be when the core problems are still there unresolved.
It's true. Exchanging hostages and prisoners is a huge humanitarian step, but it doesn't magically fix those deeper political and security issues that keep this conflict going. These pauses are vital, but they're also super shaky if there isn't real progress on those fundamental levels.
And the very next day, March 18th, 2025, the situation on the ground escalated dramatically.
It did.
There were widespread Israeli airstrikes all across Gaza. Reports described it as the most intense military action since that January ceasefire. This wasn't just a gradual ramping up of things. This was a major offensive.
Right. That phrasing, the most intense since the ceasefire, really points to a conscious decision by Israel to apply a lot of pressure. It's more than just a symbolic gesture. It signals a serious and determined military operation.
And tragically, this renewed intensity came with a terrible human cost. Early reports said that at least 44 people were killed in these strikes, including children. That's just absolutely devastating. And on top of that, so many others were injured. The immediate impact on the civilian population was immense.
And looking at the specific areas targeted, Rafah, Khan Younis, Deir al-Balah, these are all densely populated parts of Gaza. When you have military actions of this scale in places like that, the risk of civilian casualties is just inevitably high. It puts even more strain on a humanitarian situation that's already critical.
The Israeli side stated that the goal of these strikes was to achieve their military objectives as set by the political leadership.
Yeah.
And of course, their main aim is still getting those remaining hostages back from Hamas. Netanyahu's office even came out and said that we should expect these operations to become even more intense going forward.
So basically, they're sending a clear message that this lack of progress on the hostage releases is the direct cause for this renewed and potentially escalating military campaign. They're drawing a very clear link between the military actions and the goal of bringing the hostages home.
Now, we have to look at this in the context of what was happening internationally.
Mm-hmm.
All this was happening while you had Arab intermediaries in the United States actively trying to mediate an extension of the ceasefire.
Right.
They were really pushing to bridge the gap between the two sides and find some way to get more hostages released and have a longer period of peace. But those efforts fell apart.
It really underscores how hard it is to find common ground in this situation. Even with all these international players involved and everyone wanting things to de-escalate, the fundamental disagreements on the core issues proved to be just too much to overcome at that point.
And we also have to remember those statements from international figures like President Donald Trump, who had supposedly issued warnings to Hamas about releasing the hostages. Now, it's tough to say exactly how much those past statements are influencing things now, but it definitely shows that the hostage issue has been a major international concern for a while.
It adds another layer of complexity. The fact that this current military response is being framed as a direct result of Hamas still holding the hostages well, that aligns with all those earlier expressions of concern. It shows that the hostage issue has been a focal point and a source of international pressure for quite some time.
So where do things stand now? We're right back in a situation of active and intense fighting with a really worrying number of casualties already. Things are being described as fluid. meaning they could change quickly, and with Israel saying that they're going to escalate military operations unless the hostages are released, it seems like we're heading into another extremely volatile phase of this conflict. That hope that came with the January ceasefire, it's gone, and now we have renewed military action and a whole lot of uncertainty.
And the possibility of these military operations escalating further is a huge concern. It raises serious questions about the potential for even more civilian casualties, and the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which is already dire, could get even worse. The fact that they're explicitly connecting their military actions to the release of the hostages, well, it suggests that unless there's some kind of negotiated breakthrough on that issue, the cycle of conflict could just keep going and even intensify.
It's really striking when you think about the whole sequence of events. The ceasefire that offered a brief moment of relief, then the diplomatic efforts, and then bam, right back to intense military action. It makes you ask, what are the underlying forces, the fundamental obstacles that make finding a lasting solution to this conflict so incredibly difficult? That's a question that really sticks with you after seeing this latest turn of events.
It does. It makes you wonder.
It really does.